Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode number 95 of the White Knuckle Podcast, powered by Ozonics. Undetectable, undeniable. Into episode number 95 of the White Knuckle Podcast. I hope everyone is staying somewhat warm in this horribly cold environment that we're living in here, at least in the northern half of the country. Today we're having part number 2 of 2 in our conversation with Bronson Strickland from Mississippi State University's Deer Lab on chronic wasting disease. I hope that y'all found some value in last week's show. I think you'll find some value in this week's show. And if nothing else, I hope that everybody is able to garner a little bit more knowledge after listening to this show than what they had prior to listening to it. So with that, I'll get started with the show. I just want to say that this was a tough series of shows to do just because it's such a hot topic with so many people, and whether it's baiting or whether it's culling deer, or whatever the hot topic is of that day, it's everyone has an opinion, and we know how the saying goes after that. But at the end of the day, I hope that you get something from this episode, and do us a favor. If you have more questions, please post them. If you disagree with what we said, please, let us know, or because I'm not an expert. Bronson's the expert. I just interject what I feel like is the right thing to do and say at that time. So again, we're not opposed to having anyone tell us that we're wrong. So please do so if you feel like we did. With that, I'll stop rambling on and let you all listen to Bronson and I finish our conversation on chronic wasting disease. Without further ado, here is Mr. Bronson Strickland. It's not even realistic to think that there's some sort of government conspiracy that's manufactured this disease. Is it?
Absolute nonsense.
Okay.
And I could say other things, but I'm choosing not to.
Right.
Absolutely absurd that a state agency, any wildlife conservation organization, would manufacture this, or I've even heard in some cases move it around and cause it. We had this little meme going on in Mississippi that about land prices, that somebody in the state agency may turn a diseased deer loose and say we've got CWD, so somebody could come in and snatch the land at a cheaper price. I mean, it just does not add up. The shift of duties that our biologists in Mississippi, I mean, some of their programs, Jason, that they're used to be doing this time of year, helping people, managing our wildlife resources, they have been completely shifted now to CWD management. And so if you dig in and talk to a biologist at what their day-to-day routine is and the amount of money and resources that are being used to manage this disease, that is, it's just nonsense.
This next question is from a Facebook viewer that had posted a question, and a lot of the questions that I'm getting are all on private messenger because people don't want to put them out there publicly, and I'm not 100% sure why. I can guess, but it really doesn't matter. They're still pertinent questions, and they all fall along the same lines, and that is, does Bronson think that deer intermingling just naturally has a higher prevalence of spreading CWD than culling, banning of baiting, banning mineral sites? Do you think that that any of those has a greater chance of spreading the disease? In other words, what are your thoughts basically on mineral sites being contaminated with prions any more than a natural scrape or a licking branch?
I guess I think that's a good question. I really do. I would, I guess, go back, Jason, to where we started with there are some things that we can do as hunters and managers to control, at least limit or stymie to some degree the spread. And there are some things that are completely out of our control, meaning that if you have deer, there's going to be the possibility it's going to be spread from animal to animal. Whether it be, as I've often will get asked the question when I'm doing a public meeting down here, is why in the world does the state wildlife agency want to limit supplemental feeding when it's completely possible that 2 bucks could be eating under the same white oak tree when it's dropping acorns? And the answer is that is something that we can't control. Deer are going to breed. Bucks are going to visit licking branches. When bucks are in bachelor groups in the summer and early fall, they're going to groom each other. Does are going to groom their fawns. Yearling bucks are going to disperse. And to me, the way I partition that in my mind, Jason, is that if you have a deer herd, normal deer behaviors, even though some of those normal deer behaviors are going to facilitate the spread, let's not complement that by doing artificial things where we're going to facilitate the spread even more. So when you get like to the culling question, I mean, this is something that's, I mean, I'm really struggling with, and a lot of biologists are struggling with, is when you look at a lot of the data, read a lot of papers, a lot of simulation modeling, trying to figure out what is the best management strategy. And that really does appear to be one of the viable strategies. And that would be reducing the deer density, reducing deer. If you don't have as many deer on the landscape, the rate of spread is not as much. The flip side of that, Jason, is you got to go through a period of time with very few deer on the landscape. And then will that be enough? Will that be enough a decade later to where you really were able, I hate to even use the term eradicate from an area, but you might be able to slow down the spread significantly. And I think that's where a lot of us, at least us people in the South, where this is brand new in our area, is that some of the questions we're struggling with is not so much at the property level, like with feeding and baiting and things like that, but at a larger scale, what do we want to do to slow this thing down? And it has some pretty dire consequences.
It absolutely does. I guess one question I had I guess I've got a couple questions. One is, hold on just a second. My Spartan camera went off on my phone, and it was at a camera that only generally it goes off with deer by, and it's on a scrape, so I knew it would probably be a buck. And our season is closed, so I'm anxious to see. Oh, it's a good one. Sorry. Shameless plug for Spartan camera. No, I'm just that's a good buck. I will actually text you the picture as we're talking. But as we're doing that, I want to get back to the culling thing. But can mineral imbalances in the soil make CWD worse? And I'll let you answer that. Can a mineral imbalance in the soil make transferring that disease harder or easier?
Not to my knowledge, Jason. I haven't seen any evidence that would suggest any type of mineral imbalance or being balanced, facilitate or not in any direction. I would go back to, you may have differences in soil properties and again, we're right on the leading edge of learning more and more about this. It may be that what we said earlier, there may be some properties of soils, clay content, the extent of organic matter and those associated acids that could denature or bind the prion where it could not be uptaken by a plant or spread. But again, the tip of the iceberg on that kind of knowledge.
If it is, just so I can frame this correctly in my mind, if it is in the soil and the soil doesn't transfer it, like you just said, very well, right? That's what if it's that kind of soil.
Right.
If a deer its saliva is still on the ground and another deer licks that saliva, then it probably is, there's a likelihood that they're going to contract the disease from that, not just the soil, correct?
That's what the evidence would suggest, yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I had that straight in my head. You talk about culling and eradication, which is what they called the eradication zone here in Wisconsin. That scares the heck out of me for a couple different reasons, and one of them is property values. But at the end of the day, we have to do what's right for the resource. And I guess I'm afraid that there isn't enough information out there to help anyone make a informed decision or the correct decision on whether or not that's a viable way of dealing with the disease. Is that accurate?
I'll tell you what, Jason, let's talk about the way another country handled this.
Okay.
And then let's move back to what we're dealing with.
Okay.
Are you familiar, Jason, with the Norway experiment?
No.
Okay. So don't quote me on this. Maybe 3 years ago,
okay,
CWD was identified in a caribou herd, a reindeer herd, in Norway. Now, different animal, little different situation. Think about that's a herd animal, lots of animals close together. And typically different herds occupy different ranges on the landscape. So a couple cases were identified in this caribou herd, and they decided, and time will tell. Time will tell if this was the best thing to do, but they thought the science was strong enough to go through with this plan. They, over the course of a year, completely eradicated that caribou herd. And I can't remember the exact number, Jason, but I want to say it was over 1,000.
Okay.
But they went through and completely killed every single animal. And they are going to monitor that range, literally the parts of the landscape that herd occupied. And they are not going to allow colonization of any other caribou on that range for a minimum of 4 years.
Okay.
With the hopes that because of the very low prevalence rate, I think they only identified 4 individuals at the time. So 4 individuals out of that vast number, but that was enough to say, we want to nip this in the bud right now for future generations. And so now we have an animal that's different. We have a landscape that's different here. I don't even know how, in a lot of places, if eradication is even possible. If it were possible, I don't know if people would want it done. And so those are some really big issues that I think state wildlife agencies and hunters are going to have to figure out in years to come. Are we just going to end up with a reality that 60, 70, 40, whatever % of my deer, my bucks are going to have CWD? And because of that, those 30, 40, 50% of the bucks that have it are likely not going to live to a ripe old age. They're going to die sooner than normal. Are we also going to live with that number of deer with the potential consequences on human health and consuming the venison, things like that? Or Are we going to take a stance like some other agencies have done with pretty severe culling? I mean, really staying in those zones, really killing a lot of deer to try to minimize the spread. The consequence, Jason, as you mentioned, is that if you hunt, own land, whatever in that area, you're going to have a really, really low deer density. And so I guess we all, from a hunting society, standpoint, are people going to want to deal with very, very low deer densities, minimizing the risk of spread and prevalence? Or do we want to have a dense deer herd like a lot of us are used to, but a lot of them are diseased? And then you got to go another step further. Well, in terms of the population dynamics and population viability over time, what is the disease doing? And it just so happens there was a paper published recently in a good journal from Wyoming, where they have had, I think, over 3 decades. And the evidence is very clear. It is a very good study. Monitoring deer over time, taking repeated samples year after year of the deer they had sampled, and it is certainly declining. And there was another study in Colorado where they had estimated I believe a 10% decline over a number of years.
Oh, really?
And yeah. So I guess think of it this way, Jason. And again, I'm not an expert on CWD by any means, but I'm reading, or I should say researching more and more to try to become that. But because I was in my office when I did the reading, so let me clarify that.
Okay.
One thing about this disease is that it's not immediate. So let's contrast it with stuff we saw in the media a few years ago with, say, something like Ebola. Mm-hmm. And buddy, you get Ebola and you've got 3 days, 3 weeks, whatever, but you're dead.
It ain't good.
It ain't good.
Right.
And you can see that once that disease moves through a population, no more people are coming in and no people are going out, and it works through a population, the disease runs its course. But when you have something like CWD, where you can live 6 months, 18 months, 2 years, and deer are able to reproduce and replace themselves, you can still have a deer population. But what may happen for those that are interested in antlers and older bucks, you may always have a deer population, but the number of bucks that are going to reach 3, 4, and 5 years of age may be cut in half because they're dying of CWD.
Well, I guess that brings up the question that I wanted to ask is I understand the logic, but if arguably all of these deer, again, let's take my 5 friends hypothetically, and all 5 tested positive, and they're all 4-year-olds, and they showed no signs of any kind of disease whatsoever. I guess what I'm looking at it going, well, what's the harm?
Well, that's a good question. I guess the harm would be based on your perspective. If you wanted them, excuse me, and maybe they didn't die of the disease,
sure,
Jason, but maybe they were predisposed to dying earlier. Mm-hmm. And if you were like one of my colleagues in Texas that they only like to harvest deer bucks at 7 years of age, then this would be devastating to them. And yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that.
Okay.
I was going a different direction, but I'll stop.
No, that's okay. And I'm merely relaying questions that I've heard over and over again, and they're good questions. But we go back to the first podcast that I ever did, which was Dr. Grant Woods. and we talked just briefly about CWD because at that point in time it was not as big of a deal as it is now. And he said the one thing that I know for sure, or that we know for sure, is exactly what you said, Bronson, and that it's fatal. Does that mean that it's the end of our deer herd and that the sky is falling? I think not. I agree. Would you agree?
I agree 100%.
Are there things that we can do to mitigate the disease from spreading? Or yeah, there are. Does anybody really have the right answer so far? Like concrete, like this is the answer to slowing down this disease. I don't know that. Can we ever get rid of it?
I think it's going to be, well, I would say in North America, getting rid of CWD in North America, I would say is impossible.
I would say it's like getting rid of cancer. It's just, and that's maybe an overstatement, but
someone may win a Nobel Prize here in 10 years and figure out something that does. But,
so be it.
With the knowledge and technology we have now, I don't think we'd ever eradicate it. I don't think you'll ever eradicate it from Wisconsin, much less North America.
But if I'm understanding you correctly, but there is value, in your opinion, in trying to curb it. In other words, doing something is better than doing nothing, in your opinion.
In my opinion, yeah.
Okay.
Let me give you two stories. And I hope your audience will give me some liberty. That this is going on some information I've heard well over a year ago, and I may have some of my numbers wrong, but hopefully the gist of it will be accurate. Two different scenarios. One is Mississippi, our neighbor to the west, Arkansas. In northwest Arkansas, when it was identified and all the subsequent sampling took place, it was like, oh my goodness. We've got over at our first sampling, State Wildlife Agency going out and collecting at random, 200 to 300 deer. And it's oh my goodness, we've got a 20+% prevalence rate,
mm-hmm.
which to someone like me in my field, that essentially means you got it. You got it. You're going to have it. You're going to be dealing with this.
Right.
And you kind of move into that containment management philosophy. Let's try to contain it as best we can. Well, then another scenario in New York, a breeding facility, a deer pen, a breeding facility. It had been identified in that facility. And I don't know if this were State Wildlife Agency personnel or hunters, but sampling around that enclosure took place. They found a few animals that tested positive. And Jason, that very likely could have been nose-to-nose contact, of one deer and deer on the inside, deer on the outside, nose-to-nose contact, something like that. But a few deer outside that pen had it. And then a very concerted effort was made to go in and lower the density as best they could of the free-ranging deer around that facility. And since then, it's been very successful. I don't know if there's been any more free-ranging cases, around that enclosure. So that is when I hear of that New York example, that's when I would move into, okay, we have identified the disease in this location. We've sampled around it. The prevalence is pretty low. I think there would be a lot of support for let's go in and try to lower the deer density and let's keep the prevalence rate really, really low. Maybe you get lucky and get it almost to zero, but who knows? And certainly by keeping that density low, you would minimize the spread of it. But then you might have a situation like in Arkansas where, my goodness, at our very first sample, 1 out of every 5 deer has it. which means we've got it,
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to be very, very difficult to control. And the Norway, the Norway example is, can we say nuclear option maybe? But that would be the most definitive way to address it. Their government's different. They may not have had input from hunters and hunting public and things like that. So, I would predict, Jason, going forward, that it's going to be state wildlife agencies making decisions on the best information they have from sampling, and probably getting input from the hunting public. How do we collectively want to go down the next 10 years of managing this disease?
And for those people who are on the bandwagon that it is a conspiracy, and listen, I'm not saying that there isn't influences that are helping shape the framework of how they're going to deal with this disease. I'm not going to say that's not going to happen. I think I'd be lying. But to think that the government has created this or is perpetuating it is absolute ridiculousness. That's just not the case at all, in my opinion. I have nothing to base that on other than my own common sense, and I don't have a lot of it. But I have ask a lot of people. It's just not realistic.
No, not at this scale. There's always, I guess, if you go back in time, you can always find a 60 Minutes episode
Mm-hmm.
where there's been some conspiracy at some point and somebody was on the take, and et cetera, et cetera. But in this case, as widespread as this is, this is just not the case. Nobody would have any incentive to have this, to deal with this in their deer herd or in their state. It's coming at an order of magnitude or more cost than it is than anybody benefiting from this.
There is validity to my statement. I think that how it ultimately gets handled. I'm not going to say that politics isn't going to play a role in that.
Absolutely, sure,
it is. That's just a fact. Welcome to democracy. That's just the way that our world works, and there's nothing that you or I are going to change it short of running for some sort of public office. One thing I can tell you, though, not tell you, but tell anybody that's listening, is if you don't get involved and don't educate yourself and sit on your hands and do nothing, don't complain about the result. There's lots of things that you can get involved and do, and whether it's getting involved with the backcountry hunters and anglers or any of the different resources or groups that are out there that are contributing financially to the studies of things like this. There's a ton of things that you can do just as an individual. But I believe we've poked holes in that theory. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I wanted to cover. I really could put you on the spot and ask your opinion on all these different programs. Like, I don't know how much you've heard about the Pay for CWD Positives program that they're proposing. And I don't remember. I sat through the presentation. I don't remember exactly what the dollar figures were, but the bottom line is that the DNR or some organization within our government would pay you for shooting a deer that tested positive for CWD, and I think that I'm not even going to interject my opinion on that. But there's all kinds of different things that are going to get thrown around here in the next little while. And I think, from Bronson, from your perspective, have you heard anything that is a no-brainer for you in terms of how to handle this going forward?
Well, my advice and our mantra here in the South, because we're new to this, is I want the most information I have And I can be proactive as a hunter. I can be proactive as a hunter, getting every deer I harvest tested. And for me, on the property I hunt, that gives me knowledge. Is the disease, after a reasonable sample, is this disease on my property or not? Furthermore, now when I'm moving from me and my hunting buddies to collectively supporting my state and my state wildlife agency, I am providing them with data. I'm helping them know, it's some of our biologists have said it best. It's really hard to manage this disease when you don't know where it's at. And so we've been doing a full court press down here, and everybody can turn in their deer. They have to drive a few miles, and that's unfortunate. You may have to drive for 20 minutes, but there are drop-off locations all over the state of Mississippi. Every hunter harvests a deer. You can drop it off, and 7 to 10 days later, you get notification if you did or if you didn't. That helps you. That helps people around you that hunt your property, and that gives the state of Mississippi data on where the disease is at, so they can make an informed decision on what the next steps are for management. It also, Jason, in terms of being a married man with kids, and my wife is in the science field as well, so she's no CWD expert, but buddy, she knows enough. And no venison will be served to our daughters that has not been tested. So that would then give us peace of mind, when we consume venison, and, we consume 3 to 4 to 5 deer a year. So we go through a lot of venison, and my wife wants to know, and until someone can prove that it is impossible for someone to get any type of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, from CWD infected deer, until that's proven impossible, that's a step she wants to take. So for us in our situation, Jason, the most proactive things we can do: turn in your samples, learn where the disease is at, stop doing things that are going to facilitate the spread of the disease. And this is something I'll make a comment on, Jason, that this is just me. I'm not representing any organization. This is just me after someone that's given a double-digit number of these presentations across the state. It is a little bit sad to me as a hunter. So again, I'm just talking of being a hunter here. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit discouraging to me to see how embedded supplemental feeding / baiting has become, and the wailing and gnashing of teeth that comes when you have to take away a bait pile to go out and enjoy a hunt. I don't like that direction we're going. And a lot of that depends on history, where you learn to hunt, what fathers, uncles, buddies, what you're accustomed to doing. But that was something that was really apparent to me dealing with people, was that it almost was not as much concern about the disease as the concern for taking away something like baiting that a hunter would perceive is going to make their hunt harder.
Gotcha.
That got under my skin.
Yeah, I think...
I'm concerned about the resource. I'm concerned about the deer herd.
Right.
And if there's a few little things we can do like that's going to minimize the spread, then I think it's worth it.
Has your stance on that changed over the years with greater knowledge, more studies, or have you always felt that way?
I have probably always felt that way. And there's a lot of different facets, aspects, for something like this. And so something that the Deer Lab, something that we have shown via our research, how important nutrition is. Sure. I mean, nutrition is critical. You are handcuffed in terms of genetic expression and things like that. If a deer does not have adequate nutrition, But a lot of people will equate nutrition equals supplemental feed. And that's not what we're saying at all. Nutrition is nutrition, whether it be from blackberry, greenbrier, winter wheat from a food plot, or from supplemental feed. It's all good nutrition. And so, what we would promote then is getting good nutrition for your deer herd through habitat management. I mean, that is the way Mother Nature intended it. And then it's a scale, right, Jason? You've got the supplemental feeding, where the point of supplemental feeding is to improve nutrition. And then you have this gray area that moves from supplemental feeding into baiting. And, that's probably where I'm most, that is just not the way I like to hunt over a bait pile. I know a lot of people are used to it, and that's the way they learned. And maybe that's my bias. Maybe that's my blind spot, Jason, is because that's not what I choose to do. That's something easy to eliminate for me. If that is a risk that I can cross off of spreading the disease through baiting through a bait pile, then that's no skin off my teeth whatsoever. But I understand a lot of people, that is a big deal to them. Right.
And I think no matter what you're talking about, you're always going. We can't all be brothers. I've said it before. I mean, but I get where you're coming from, and I'm in the same boat. I didn't grow up hunting that way. I have, over the years used mineral, corn, whatever the case, to get an inventory of deer, and it's tough, in our area because you can't do that in Wisconsin. But it sounds like I think I've heard from you overwhelmingly that the absence of doing that has a far greater consequence than by not doing it. In other words, if you're not getting a bunch of deer to come to a mineral site and, perpetuating or giving them a greater chance of contracting the disease, you're probably doing things, or at least taking a step in the right direction. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's a hot topic. And that was the one other question that I wanted to ask you is there any validity to the argument that, okay, well, if we're going to feed these deer mineral and thus, let's assume that scientifically it's been proven that that boosts their health, which one could argue would boost their ability to fight a disease. Is it not going to fight this disease? Is it not going to fight the probability of them contracting it?
There's no evidence at this point, Jason, to suggest that. And it's just, I think, the nature of this infectious agent. You might look at it if this were a bacterial infection, if this were a virus, someone that's very well nourished, someone that's really healthy, their immune system is healthy, they might be able to either completely stave off some type of infection, or if they become infected, they can work through it a lot better. But I don't think we're dealing with that same kind of system when we're dealing with these prion diseases. Now that being said, it would not surprise me one bit if someone were to say, I have a really malnourished deer here, and this malnourished deer gets exposed to these infectious prions, and they become clinical a lot sooner. That wouldn't surprise me one bit. That they don't have the lack of a better word, they don't have the wherewithal. Their body is not working optimally to fight anything. It wouldn't surprise me a bit if someone were to say, hey, those are the deer that die within 6 months versus one that's otherwise very healthy. They might die within 18 months. But there's been no evidence so far to suggest that the animal's health is going to essentially eliminate the chance of them getting the disease.
Okay. That's pretty cut and dried.
And you know how all this is, Jason. We may look back on this 5 years from now, and there may be an answer. There may be someone that's found the key and unlocked some system that can help with this. But I guess, Jason, you've kind of taken a liking to me saying on the average. We might have to say at this point in time, and evidence suggests at this point in time that this is the way it works.
Right. Right. Yikes. It's scary. Again, especially for me, because you look at that map for Wisconsin and where you see that darkest red, well, Jason's not too far from there. So I'm concerned as to, well, what does that look like for me next year? I don't know that it changes next year, but what does it look like for me in 3 years? I just signed a 7-year lease or a 5-year lease. What is it? What did I just do? I don't think that I think it would be ridiculous to think that there won't be any deer. But I don't know that it would be ridiculous to think that there will be less deer.
You're probably right.
But again, we don't know. But I guess based on the information we have right now, it would be reasonable to come to that conclusion. But
hey, Jason, I've got an idea for you.
Yeah.
This might be a future episode for you.
Okay.
So let me qualify this on the front end that I may be wrong about this. I may have misheard. I may have misunderstood. But I was at a big conference this summer, and they had a whole session devoted to CWD, and I got to listen to some really good researchers from all over the nation. And there was an example given comparing Wisconsin to Illinois. And as I understood, the speaker was that Illinois really made it a much more concerted effort to, I don't know if this was just legal harvest. I don't know if they liberalized the bag limits. I don't know if they used literally culling from state agency personnel, et cetera. But what I gleaned from that talk was that Illinois really kept their foot on the gas for sampling and harvesting a lot more deer to keep densities lower in areas where the disease had been identified. That might be something you want to look into since that's your neighbor to the south. You may want to talk with some hunters from that area. If you need help hooking you up with some researchers from Illinois, I can certainly help you do that. I know someone personally I can hook you up with. That might be a comparison you want to make, is how is the disease growing spatially and in prevalence in Illinois, and how is it going in Wisconsin? And that might change people's opinions on what to do next.
Okay. Do you have just a few more minutes for a few more questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Has there been any progress that you're aware of with breeding genetic CWD resistant deer in captivity?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Not that I'm aware of.
Because I've heard, deer breeders seem to think that they're going to be the ultimate answer to CWD, by breeding some sort of genetic resistance into their herd. But based on what I'm hearing from you, there's no noteworthy results.
Not at this point. That does not surprise me one bit. I mean, I've heard over the past year or so that people are looking into it, researchers are looking into it. And in a nutshell, that's essentially how scrapie was conquered in sheep. Is that now you've got a lot of animals you can test with sheep, a domestic animal, but they eventually found a genotype that was more or less impervious to the scrapie prions, and then basically could start breeding herds of animals that were not susceptible to the disease. So I think the logic is I can't say foolproof. That's good logic that may be a possibility.
Okay. Another question that I've gotten is, why is so much money spent on testing for CWD when no one has come up with an adequate means of controlling it once it's found?
Well, I think it's a two-pronged answer there. You can't manage it if you don't know where it's at. So testing is critical to know where the disease is at. People want to know where the disease is at in terms of, can I eat this venison or not? So there's a lot of good reasons to keep putting money into knowing where the disease is at. I guess the other part of that answer is trying to figure out what to do in terms of investing money in other solutions. I think people are trying to figure out what those other solutions are. And we might have to wait for research to give us some new answers in that regard.
Okay.
Did I get the question right, Jason?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know that you can, answer that question any differently than what you did. Again, if I'm a deer hunter and car salesman, not a wildlife researcher, biologist, or doctor, or any of those things. But it just is logical to me that doing something is better than doing nothing. So just because we don't necessarily know how to control it, I don't know, again, and this is just me, that I don't know that it makes any sense on any level to just say, well, shit, let's just stop testing anything at all.
Yeah. Let's just let it run its course.
It doesn't. Yeah. And I understand that there's people that say, it's been here, it's always going to be here. And they may be right.
Yeah. I have a hard time with that. I can yield and say, you know what? Maybe in some places it has always been here, or at least for 3, 4, 5 decades, whatever. I do not believe that it's always been a 40% prevalence rate in a couple counties in Wisconsin. I do not believe that.
I think that conventional wisdom would agree with you.
Yeah.
I'm smart enough to figure that out.
And when you go to CWDinfo.org and you start looking at some of those maps, and you start looking at some of the confined populations, and then subsequently it's been found in the wild deer adjacent to it. Again, conventional wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
It sure is coincidental that we know this confined population had it. And what do you know? We've got deer all around that facility that have it as well. To me, that does not lead me down the road of it's always been there in that location.
Right. Okay. All right. I'm not going to say that I hadn't shared that same opinion that it's always been there, and but I have the good fortune. I always say it's a blessing and a curse to do this podcast because, well, sometimes you end up getting tunnel vision about some things and not about others, and it's brought to light a whole nother way of thinking about it. And I think once you also start to think about the resource and realize that the resource is really what's most important here, and doing the right thing for the resource, I think it changes the way that you critically think about it.
Yeah, and let's think about along with that, let's think about the next generation or two.
For sure.
So I've got a buddy, that's kind of, some of his property is up near one of these zones in North Mississippi, and he's kind of said, hey, if I have to take it on the chin and We have to reduce deer density by a great deal. And if that, at least in this point in time, if that leads us to believe that my grandson's going to be able to chase deer on this property, 40 years from now, I'm going to do it. So you got to think about the resource and future hunting generations.
Yeah, it's a concern. My son asked me when he heard me talking. I got home from the ATA show here on Saturday or Sunday, and we started to talk about that. And one of his questions was, what did you learn about that? I said, well, Jackson, this really wasn't a CWD conference, but. He said, well, he goes to the Marines in June, and he said, when I'm done with my 4 years, do you think there'll be deer to hunt, or will I be able to hunt deer, or do you think this was my last season? And I'm like, no, I don't believe that it was your last season. I think there may not be as many deer to hunt. There may be more deer to hunt. I don't know, but I believe there'll be deer to hunt.
As do I. As do I.
One last question, and then I will I'll let you go unless you have anything to follow up. And it's a question I've been dying to ask, and I wrote it real early in all my questions, but I wanted to get around the topic as much as we could before I asked you. In based on the knowledge that you have now, are there any states that have realized a lower prevalence or geographic spread of CWD after they've banned feeding or using mineral?
Not off the top of my head, Jason, but I'm trying to very quickly think my way through here. I don't know if that's a type of study where you can risk having a treatment and control, meaning we're going to take this half of the state and we're not going to limit mineral sites. We're not going to limit supplemental feeding. And then on this side of the state, we are. Because if you're wrong, the consequences are too dire. And so I think you would probably start with the perspective of, what does the most recent best science tell us what we should do to minimize damage, minimize spread, and go that route? I hope does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what I just heard you say is, I don't know that that's a valid argument to bait.
Yeah. Yeah, that'd be one way to look at it. I mean, there would just be too much risk involved doing that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
I don't think a wildlife agency I don't think they could live with themselves to say, hey, we're just going to run a little natural experiment here. And if you end up being really wrong, let's say you had double, triple, quadruple the rate of facilitating spread by allowing supplemental feeding. Oh my gosh. How could you live with yourself?
Right. I get it. Conventional wisdoms, again. Yeah, just common sense. Okay, gotcha. I guess the short answer to that question, though, is there hasn't been any, peer-reviewed study done that suggests that banning feeding or using minerals, if we want to get right down to the nuts and bolts, there hasn't been anything that suggests that it had a difference on the spread of the disease.
Not that I'm aware of, Jason, in a situation where all things are equal.
Right.
So you might have a state took a different stance on it, and this state had this stance on it, but there's also a whole bunch of other dynamics that could be going on there that could confuse cause and effect.
Okay.
So, really to run that type of study, that would be a good opportunity if you had a really, really giant high fence and you'd have 1,000 acres on this side and 1,000 acres on this side, and run that type of experiment for 5 years and see what the result would be. because you'd really need to control for all the other things that could be facilitating spread as well. Are the deer densities about the same? Are carcasses being handled the same way? In that area, had deer been moved into the area? There'd just be a lot of other things you'd have to control for if you were really going to isolate the effect down to feeding or baiting or mineral licks, etc.
And again, that's not saying that it's the it's the catalyst for spreading CWD. Nobody's saying that.
Yeah, professionally, but both wildlifers and foresters, and probably a lot of other disciplines as well, we use the acronym is BMP. BMP stands for Best Management Practices. And in this type of case where CWD is on the landscape, the best management practices, when it comes to food, would be do not concentrate deer. The more they're concentrated for the longest period of time, the greater the probability is going to be spread from animal to animal. That's just the bottom line.
Well put. I think the bottom line for Jason is control the things that you can. The things that you can't, well, you can't.
You can't.
Period. Well, there you have it. My conversation with Mr. Bronson Strickland from MSU's Deer Lab. Thanks a lot, Bronson. You've not only been a great guest, you've been a great friend in sort of walking me through this process as I learn what is responsible to do, what's responsible to talk about, and I appreciate your unbiased opinion. That said, like I said at the start of the show, if you have a question, comment, or concern, don't be afraid to post it on our Facebook page. We'd love to hear from you. We definitely would love to have more conversations about this and have a public conversation, whether it's on a Facebook page or wherever, so that we can all, help better facilitate the handling of this disease in the proper way so that it gets, past us as quickly as it possibly can, and we can protect the resource for generations to come. It's really our duty and responsibility to make sure that we leave it as good as we found it, and better if we can. So that's my 2 cents. I hope you have a great week. Stay warm, like I said at the start of the show, and hopefully spring will eventually come and we'll all be talking about turkey hunting. Thanks much for listening and have a great week. Jason out.